Understanding the imbalance and redefining of what harm is. The first part of chapter 3, 3A, shows that there is a difference in how we handle different types of deviant behavior. So, for individuals, what we know as street crime, we have the criminal law, which is created by legislators. For corporations or white collar crime, mostly we rely on federal regulatory agencies, and very rarely is the criminal law used to define these behaviors. A lot of times these disparities exist because of political influence to reduce or eliminate regulations, and ultimately to use the media to frame whatever issue the corporation wants and use fear or unfairness to get the general public to think that they are correct. So the beginning of corporations really happens at the beginning of colonization. And one of the more famous corporations was the Virginia Company of London, which settled in Jamestown, and its goal was to make money for England. Corporations, though, were looked on as being suspicious. And so if they became a public nuisance, the people could vote to relieve them of their duties. There should be real democratic control, meaning laws and stipulations over corporations. And then ultimately, legislatures had the sovereign right to withdraw their charters. So if they didn't serve the public, they basically could shut them down. So the whittling away of these ideas happens very early, and the first case is in 1819. What makes this case important is one, educationally, it establishes that there can be private colleges without state or federal influence. But second, and more important to this PowerPoint, is that the Chief Justice defined what a corporation was. So it's a long definition, and you can come back to the slide and read it. The primary thing that we're trying to point out that there were some issues with the definition itself. There's some terms that are used that really don't describe what a corporation actually is. So the Chief Justice defined it as artificial. But corporations are made up of real people and they have real motives. The primary motive of a corporation is to make money through the sale of whatever products they're selling. Invisible was another word used by the Chief Justice. But although a corporation is seen as an invisible entity, the impact and consequences of its actions are very visible. He referred to it as a mere creature of the law, which really minimizes the actions and powers that the corporation wields, not only over its workers, but over its products and how those products are put forward to the people. He also referred to it as immortality, which really puts the corporation above humankind and ultimately then gives it the right of personhood through recalling it acts like an individual. The next case is still back in the 1800s, and this is where a county is suing a corporation for delinquent taxes. And the county ultimately had the railroad had put up fences, and the county referred to those as land improvements and wanted them to pay more for taxes, and the railroad didn't want to, so it got appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court's ruling, they said that the county didn't have jurisdiction to assess a fence tax, as the Constitution only stated the franchise roadway roadbed rails, and rolling stock. Now, where do you think the fence was? Was it on the roadway roadbed, close to the rails? um, so the court ruled that the Constitution required a separate assessment for land and improvements, and therefore the county's assessment was illegal. And how they compared this, the case, was they compared it to how an individual property owner would be assessed versus the corporation. So what this case did was really allow the 14th Amendment protections to go to corporations. Another case, now bringing it to the 70s, 1970s, was a case where corporate donations for ballot initiatives were illegal in Massachusetts unless a corporation had a direct interest. In other words, corporations couldn't give donations. And so the bank said, well, we want to give donations. And they, again, appealed this all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that this statute was invalid. And so ultimately, at this point, it gives corporations the freedom of speech. And speech is interpreted very broadly to mean that money is one way of freedom of speech. Now, I put down the dissenting opinion because I like the idea behind this. So Rehnquist said, restrictions upon the political activity of business corporations are both politically desirable and constitutionally permissible. Since already legally designated within corporate personhood, no need for corporate lobbyists clogging up Congress working on behalf of special interests. Indeed, the states might reasonably fear that the corporation would use its economic power to obtain further benefits beyond those already bestowed. Someone should have listened to him. So the demise of democracy really brings us to the case that you might not know the details about, but have heard, and that's Citizens United versus the Federal Election Committee. And so one of the things is that when I first was looking at this, I said, what's Citizens United? Well, Citizens United is a political action committee, or what we refer to as PAC. And it's primarily funded by the Koch brothers. And so it's a libertarian, ultra conservative look at how life should be in the United States. So libertarians want to eliminate government as much as possible, and they don't want any regulations telling them what they can or cannot do with their businesses. So if you want to pollute, you can pollute, because that will make you more money than putting restrictions on your pollutions that might take away money. That's kind of the idea of how libertarians view things. So Citizens United really challenged a bipartisan effort to create some limits on what could be given to political campaigns. And so the Campaign Reform Act of 2002 prohibited corporations and unions from using their general treasury funds to make independent expenditures for speech defined as what is referred to as electioneering communications, or for speech that expressly advocates the election or defeat of a candidate. And you could establish a political action committee for this purpose. And so basically what they're saying is that corporations really can't enter into influencing the political arena, particularly today, through electronic communications, whether it be emails, whether it be advertisements, whether it be now social media. So ultimately, the case started with a small company who created a documentary critical of then Senator Hillary Clinton, who was running for president the first time. And it appeared to violate this act's corporate engineering communication. And so ultimately, Citizens United, then this PAC gives the money to the small company to push forward, representing this small company, the idea that they should be able to give money. And so the Supreme Court in this decision really turned their back on existing precedent that was over 100 years old. It narrowed the traditional anti-corruption rationale that had been used in these past cases to basically thinking that if you give corporate influence, that they will take advantage and use it to make the system corrupt. And now the court said that this undue influence really isn't corruption. The Supreme Court then ultimately said that these independent expenditures really aren't a risk to corruption. Um, and they didn't really look at any facts to come to this conclusion. And thus, with Citizens United, the Supreme Court invalidated all limits on outside spending, which has really led to what we call super PACs and dark organizations to influence voters. So you see these all the time and you wonder who put up this commercial? Well, they don't have to tell you because dark organizations, which is referred to dark money, don't have to expose who they are. So the reading that you have is really that people originally were concerned that for-profit corporations would spend and dominate the elections. And even though that their influence has increased, these super PACs, but the study that you look at really finds out, which is really scary, that fewer than 200 people and their spouses ultimately are putting in millions and millions of dollars to ultimately influence the political elections in this country. So the next part we're going to look at is two videos that really kind of show how the media can persuade people to see things from the corporation's viewpoint. So you have two videos. One is the famous McDonald's case where a woman gets burned by a cup of hot coffee to really push tort reform, which benefits corporations. And then a case that after tort reform occurs, who it really affects. Does it affect corporate world or does it affect the individual?